Let's now go back to our top story, to the mass shooting at a grocery store in New York State where 10 people were killed, an attack being investigated as a hate crime. So we thought we'd discuss this further with news analyst Joseph Williams. He's a former senior news editor for US News and World Report. Thank you very much for your time. Now, in terms of the title that this crime has been given, racially motivated hate crime, how quickly are these kinds of crimes classified in this way? And how often would you say mass shootings in the US are described as hate crimes?
I would say very rarely. This one is shocking to me, or very surprising at the very least, about the fact that police almost immediately classified it as a hate crime. What typically tends to happen is that a shooting will happen, and even though an identifiable group has been targeted very clearly by the shooter, authorities are really hesitant to try to classify it as a hate crime, mainly because it's hard to get inside the shooter's head and know specifically exactly why he did what he did and why he targeted these group of people. And typically the shooters in many of these mass shooting situations end up committing suicide and taking their motivations to the grave with them. But for Buffalo, he very clearly, the shooter who has not been identified yet, very clearly had a manifesto online. His targets were very clearly minorities, and the evidence, at least what we know so far, is almost incontrovertible to the fact that he was targeting minorities in a very clear and deliberate way.
Yes, you mentioned that, often that, the attacker commits suicide in these sorts of cases. We don't know the circumstances specifically. It was understood that he was pointing at his neck and somehow he was averted from killing himself, whether he had that plan to do so or not. How rare is it that attackers in mass shootings are found alive like this? Or is there something to be said about the way in which he sent out this manifesto? It's a racially motivated hate crime. Is there a kind of martyrdom that perhaps attackers like this want to carry by keeping themselves alive?
Well, I think there are two things here. I mean, martyrdom can be accomplished a variety of ways. I mean, most notably, a lot of martyrs claim to be martyrs by killing themselves or by dying in a hail of bullets with police and showing that until the end they were quite defiant. But here, this particular instance has kind of at its core the nexus of two very real problems that the United States have struggled to get their arms around. One is domestic white supremacist violence and the white supremacist cause that has been reignited over the past few years by President Donald Trump, and most notably by the insurrection at the Capitol in January 21. And the second nexus is the problem that we have with gun violence and easy access to high-powered weapons that are more likely to be found on a battlefield than in real life and in your neighborhood grocery store. But typically the martyrdom here also reminds me of the shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, where that was another white supremacist who very clearly wanted the world to know what he was thinking and what he was doing, because he too live streamed his actions on, if I'm not mistaken, on Facebook Live as he was going about killing random Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand, a few years back. So clearly they want the world to know what they're doing. They want their admirers and fellow travelers to know that they themselves were unafraid to go into the deep and go into the depths of a depravity that their others may seem hesitant about, but will very willingly talk about online. So we have two very real problems here, and a third element on top of it, which is the notoriety that you're talking about, that the United States government has to get its arms around. They cannot afford to let this go on any longer. Too many lives have been lost, and this is such a tragedy that will bring attention to this. But what's going to happen once that attention happens remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of points that I'd love to pick up from that. One of them is the live streaming element of this. Do you think that there is something about American culture now that no event, no matter how catastrophic and brutal it is, even something like a live shooting can be seen as some sort of entertainment for the cyberverse?
Unfortunately, I have to agree with you on that. And it's not only viewed as entertainment, it's also viewed as a cause of legitimacy. People who argue about these sorts of things online and who go into the dark corners and the dark recesses of white supremacy often want to prove their legitimacy by guaranteeing that something will happen rather than just talk about it. I mean, the January 6th insurrection was a part of that, where there was a lot of talk online about how the government was illegitimate and how they were, quote unquote, stealing this election, but only a hardcore few only the brave few, as they see themselves, are willing to do something about it. And I think that that's what's being spurred by these sorts of incidents. And you have the sort of social media element to it too, where there's a lot of banter about these sorts of things, and social media has struggled to crack down on people who are saying such things. So the next step beyond declaring your white supremacy or declaring that you believe all minorities to be inferior is to go out and prove it. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of this happen. We saw Dylan Roof in the South Carolina shooting. We saw the Christchurch, New Zealand shooting that I was speaking of. Even Dylan Rittenhouse, who shot some people in Wisconsin after the police were trying to crack down on protests over police shooting of another man. He intended to prove that his bona fides were in fact real, and he could prove it because he's got access to a weapon and he's got the backing of thousands, hundreds of thousands perhaps, followers online who are egging him on, who are telling him, yes, show us what you're willing to do in service of our cause.
Joseph, really appreciate your analysis on a very troubling news day. Thank you very much for that. Joseph Williams, news analyst there.
My pleasure.